Hello, Why Religion listeners. Professor Anthony Sweat here from BYU Church History and Doctrine. Welcome to another great episode of the Why Religion podcast. When the 2002 Winter Olympics came to Utah, if you remember, it was a big deal for us as Latter-day Saints. Not only was the world stage coming to Salt Lake City for a few weeks, but members of the church intuitively also knew that the reputation of the church would go out on the world stage for much, much longer. Many Latter-day Saints collectively wondered, what in the world will the world think of us? That question has been a common one in the history of the church. How does the rest of the world think about us as a people of faith? We've long been written about, caricatured, defended, condemned, praised, or even vilified in the national press. During the federal polygamy crusades against the church in the mid to late 1800s, for example, it's estimated that the church was written about once every week in the New York Times on average. That focus in the international and national eye hasn't dropped since we dropped polygamy. I've long been interested in how the church is portrayed in national outlets like Time magazine, and have noticed how often they seem to mention the church, almost sometimes disproportionately to our national membership, in their presses. I'm keen on whether the article is accurate or inaccurate, if it's positive or if it's negative. As a podcaster, I've long listened to national popular podcasts like This American Life by NPR, and their show seems to also have a preoccupation with our people and a fascination with our faith, as do other national and international presses. Well, if the press has long been fixed on us, BYU Church History and Doctrine professor J.B. Haws has long been fixated on the press and how the public perception of the church in those presses has shifted over time and some of the reasons why. He is the author of a landmark book called The Mormon Image in the American Mind, 50 Years of Public Perception, published by Oxford University Press. He has also recently published an article called, quote, On the Pages of the Post, Latter-day Saints and Washington's Newspaper of Record, end of quote, published in the Religious Studies Center's book on the history of the church in Washington, D.C. Here's Professor Haws talking about how he noticed what the media said about the Latter-day Saints, even from his childhood watching BYU football.
But even then, I think one of the things that stood out to me, even as a kid, that's how obvious this was that every discussion about BYU football also dealt with the church. And there were conversations in the national media about serving missions and returned missionaries and the word of wisdom. And I was just intrigued, as a young Latter-day Saint to say, wow, this is interesting to watch what people are saying about Latter-day Saints.
In today's episode, I hope you are also equally intrigued and fascinated to find out about the perception of the church in the American public press, specifically since 1950, and the events that have shaped those perceptions and still shape them today. This is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
Recently, BYU religion professor Brad Wilcox from the Department of Ancient Scripture sat down with his colleague from the Department of Church History and Doctrine, Professor J.B. Haws, which, as an aside, Dr. Haws was recently appointed as the new department chair of Church History and Doctrine, so that Professor Wilcox could interview Professor Haws about his publication on the public perception of the church since the 1950s. In part one, Professor Haws will talk a little bit about why he did this study and what he found. He will begin in the 1950s, discussing how this was the golden era of the church in the American public eye, and why. He will then take us on a church and American history journey through the 60s, 70s, the Civil Rights Movement, the Equal Rights Amendment, the God Makers video, the Hoffman bombings, President Gordon B. Hinckley, and his outreach with the media, the 2002 Salt Lake Winter Olympics, Mitt Romney's run for president, I'm the Mormon campaign, and much, much more, showing how each of these events shifted the public perception of the church, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively. In part 2, as usual, he will move a little bit more into why this research publication matters, talking about some of the factors that influences how the church is seen today. And in part 3, he will give us a little bit of the whys behind his own bio, why he chose to be an academic, why he became a religious educator, and why he came to BYU and chooses to be a man of faith. So without any further delay, here is Professor Brad Wilcox interviewing Professor J.B. Haws.
Tell me a little bit about where this passion came from, because for years you have researched the public perception of the church through the lens of the national press. Where did that come from? Your American history training?
Yeah, I think that certainly was part of it. I have to pay a real tribute to my supervising professor at the University of Utah, Bob Goldberg, who phenomenal historian, someone who has been really interested and invested in looking at social movements in the United States, a really keen eye in kind of this dialogue that happens in society that shapes public perception. So he was a strong influence. But again, as funny as it sounds, I think this goes back to BYU football. And I say that only partly facetiously because as a 10-year-old kid, the first season that I watched every single BYU football game was 1984. And
that was a good season to watch.
That was a very good season to start on. So BYU goes undefeated. They win the national championship. And I mean, so much of my emotions were tied to that season. But even then, I think one of the things that stood out to me, even as a kid, that's how obvious this was that every discussion about BYU football also dealt with the church. And there were conversations in the national media about serving missions and returned missionaries and the word of wisdom. And I was just intrigued, as a young Latter-day Saint to say, wow, this is interesting to watch what people are saying about Latter-day Saints. And so I think that was an early interest to see how these moments of capturing the nation's attention also have an impact on what people think about Latter-day Saints.
Well, I think we could go back to the very beginning of the church, and most of the press was very negative about the Latter-day Saints. But let's just go back to the 50s. Let's start there, and let's look at what the image of the church has been through these years that are basically the years of our lives. I was born in 59, so I would have been born just at the end of this 50s, which is the time of David O. McKay, and it's the time of great church growth. Tell us a little bit about why the 50s became such a incredible time for the church as far as this shift in public opinion.
Yeah, great place to start. These post-war decades, post-World War II decades are so interesting for many, many reasons. And what a lot of observers, a lot of researchers have noticed is the strong rise of religiosity in the United States.
It was cool to be a member of a church.
That's right. So church membership increases, church attendance increases. And so sociologists have looked at a lot of things that are going on that time. The baby boom, a huge spike in marriage and in raising families, and that often correlates well with church attendance, wanting to raise families in the church. There also was something really important about the civic religion happening in this time period. We can't escape the implications of the Cold War.
Yeah, and just this anti-communism feel that then said, hey, we don't want to be godless.
That's exactly right. So we have President Eisenhower saying rather famously, that to be American is to be religious, and I don't care what religion that is, essentially. And I think World War II had also had important implications in exposing different Americans to people of different faith backgrounds. And so what starts to happen is an end to maybe the Protestant hegemony, the Protestant dominance, cultural dominance. And so there is more space for Roman Catholics, more space for Jews. This is the era that sociologists have called tripartite America, the Protestant Catholic Jew model. And so I think religiosity, number one, as becoming part of the American fabric, and then this openness for more religious traditions to find space in the American cultural landscape, number two.
Wasn't it about that period where they added the words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Yeah, very good. So under God is added the Pledge of Allegiance. In God we trust is placed on the nation's currency. So there's a strong sense of, again, this idea of civic religion and religiosity as a patriotic manifestation of what it means to be an American. And Latter-day Saints figure into this really, really nicely and really well, such that there is now more attention to Latter-day Saint respectability than Latter-day Saint deviance as in previous generations. I think it's also important to back up just one step, and that is the Great Depression. The church's welfare plan was phenomenally successful at generating positive press. And researchers like Jan Ships, who have surveyed a huge number of national periodicals, note that the trend line really crossed from mostly negative to mostly positive in the 1930s. And that trajectory just continues really well into the 1940s and 1950s.
Well, and if you think about 47 was the centennial year of the Saints coming into the Valley, right, and that received a lot of national press.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, this is a cover story on a number of national magazines. This hits at all things American, sort of the romantic notion of conquering the West, an independent people. But also these attributes that Latter-day Saints seem to manifest: their frugality, their hardworking, their community spirit, strong, stable, moral families. All of those things become celebrated. And this is the new portrait of Latter-day Saints, and it just is in lockstep with what Americans are valuing.
Then we start moving into the 60s. We start moving into the 70s. And you've done a lot of research looking at public opinion through the articles in the Washington Post. Now, why specifically the Washington Post?
Yeah, so that article is part of a volume that is in the Regional Studies in Church History series that the Church History Department here at BYU, Church History and Doctrine Department here at BYU puts out. And so this volume is specifically focused. This volume is specifically focused on Washington, D.C. and its connection with Latter-day Saints. So I thought it was interesting to see what has the Washington Post said about Latter-day Saints, and as a really important national paper of record, it is in some ways it becomes a bit of a representative sample of what's happening in other major news outlets across the country.
Yeah, you've always heard of the competition between the New York Times and Washington Post, but I didn't realize until I read your article that the Washington Post outpaced the New York Times, and that even today, 890.1 million page views.
That point you're making is really important, that what's happening, it seems like currently with the Washington Post, is the Washington Post is making quite a presence on the digital landscape for journalism. And so they are having a lot of success in their digital platforms and becoming, I would say, a more important news source than maybe ever before.
Well, as you've looked through the Washington Post over the decades, I think it's interesting to see that there are some positive things that are being said about the church. In June 1981, a story appeared in which Catholic leaders encouraged people to have family night. And they actually said, follow the example of the members of the church.
Yeah, that's it's such an interesting thing, trying to get a handle on what this idea of the public opinion, public perception of Latter-day Saints is is not always easy. In some ways it's not a precise target. It's one that moves around. So I think we're trying to extrapolate from a lot of points of data. But it is, and so maybe one metaphor to think of it is this idea of a mosaic that's made up from a lot of different snapshots. And so when you step back and see the whole mosaic put together, you start to see some patterns and some trends. And so I think that that headline, that passage that you quoted, is an important one. That Latter-day Saints, even from fellow religionists, were generating quite a bit of praise and positive reception for, especially the family values. Late 70s and early 80s, that was no question. The church was being recognized for its family friendliness.
Then we also see the opposition. We see the national press looking at the view of the Latter-day Saints toward the Equal Rights Amendment. We see the God Makers film that starts being shown across the nation. And the forger turned murderer, Mark Hoffman, starts gaining a lot of national attention too. Could you talk a little bit about those? What was going on with the ERA that made it that made the Latter-day Saints stand on it such a magnet for national attention?
Yeah, this is such an interesting decade. I think this decade of the long 80s, we might say, so the tail end of the 70s and into the early 90s is a really pivotal time for the national impressions, American impressions especially, about Latter-day Saints. And I think where it really starts to gain momentum is in the early 70s, on the heels of some tough things that had happened. So the late 60s and the early 70s had one of the things that had really impacted public perception about Latter-day Saints was more attention on the church's restriction of not ordaining black men who were members of the church to the priesthood, or allowing its black members into the temple.
Because this was all during the Civil Rights movement.
So as in this height of the Civil Rights movement, as more attention is being given to the church's position and its racial restrictions on priesthood and temple blessings, there were protests at BYU sporting events. This generated all kinds of attention, and this was a really difficult time for Latter-day Saints who were trying to navigate all of this that's happening in the nation. People like George Romney, who are nationally prominent figures, trying to handle this. And church leaders too were concerned about how do we express some of the positive aspects of our theology. And one of the things that church leaders determined by doing some national surveys, which they had not done prior to the early 1970s, was that there just wasn't an awareness of Latter-day Saint beliefs apart from some of the standbys like polygamy and the Tabernacle Choir. So what the church did was encourage its public relations arms to start thinking of ways to creatively message about the church's belief in the families, and that led to Homefront.
The Homefront series, yes.
Which may have been the most successful campaign in the church's history, these public service announcements that were very much about family values. And this had a big impact in drawing attention to the church's beliefs about the families.
I remember when the church did advertisements in the Reader's Digest
Right.
focusing on the Osmond family.
Yeah, very good. This is that same period. But at the very time that the church is promoting its family values, this is the time when we start to feel the ground shift a little bit towards families and towards especially the roles and rights of women. And the Equal Rights Amendment hits at this very time, and as church leaders oppose the Equal Right Amendment, and this is so many nuances and complexities to this, but maybe what we could say in summary is that the First Presidency's message was not to oppose rights for women or to deny that women needed more rights, but that the Equal Rights Amendment was not the right way to do it.
It was poorly worded.
And that the feeling was that it could give the Supreme Court too much room to play with.
It could actually end up hurting people.
Right, and this was the church's position. This was the position of other national groups.
And it didn't pass.
It didn't pass. It didn't pass. And so the church's opposition drew a lot of attention and drew the ire of a number of commentators. It also sort of raised a new issue in reporting about the church, and that was fear that perhaps the church that had seemed so benign and wholesome, maybe there was a power to manipulate politics, a power to mobilize a huge number of voters that could then promote their own agenda. And so this
some of the
changed
same
tone.
fear that was felt back in the days of Missouri, back in the days of Nauvoo.
Right. So I think that's a good way of thinking of it, as a resuscitation of some of these earlier fears. And then that was only compounded, as you said, well, by the God makers. This idea from a number of evangelical Christian groups that Latter-day Saints were deceptive and that the family image was a counterfeit. And then finally, Mark Hoffman, who really was producing counterfeits, just seemed to fit into this narrative. So it's this 1, 2, 3 punch that something strange or something underhanded might be happening in Salt Lake City. And those are tough to escape.
I think it's so interesting that you point out that during the Mark Hoffman period, there was a focus on the murders and a focus on, the church is hiding its past. But when it came out that these were forgeries, that he had actually forged all of this, that didn't get front page news. Yeah. That was overlooked by the national news. And instead, what lingered was this idea of secrecy. And then, you have the God maker saying it's cult. And that word somehow just stuck in people's minds to the point that even today, people still associate the church with cult unless they know better.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think those were remarkably impactful and it had lasting significance. And it seemed to fit the narrative that was coming from a number of different sides and just reinforced in people's minds that there's something to be afraid of here, or at least something to be suspicious of.
You pointed out that in 1977, a Gallup poll found that 54% of Americans surveyed responded that they viewed Mormons very favorably or somewhat favorably. But by 1991, a similar poll showed that only 27% of the respondents had a favorable view of the church. But I think it's interesting that when they dig a little deeper, they look at the church one way and they look at church members very differently, which is similar to what we see in education. If you ask anybody on the street, how's American education? They'll usually give you a negative response. But if you say, how do you feel about the school your kids go to? They will always be favorable.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that we see the same phenomenon in this image of the church.
Interesting. Yes, I think that's right. There is this interesting this interesting dichotomy between an institutional image and an individual image, local versus general. That's interesting. I think it follows along really similar lines.
How did Gordon B. Hinckley help to kind of shift that?
I can't say enough about how much I admire President Hinckley's ability to face things with fearlessness and openness. And in some ways, as he becomes the president of the church in 1995, right on the heels of this very difficult decade, almost immediately he starts to signal a different approach. And I should say, I think as we look back on it, certainly some of the church's moves and defensiveness and feeling threatened I think is certainly understandable, certainly reasonable.
It's our whole history.
Right, exactly. But I think President Hinckley represents leading us out of that and into a new era of openness, a new era of vulnerability, to let down some of our guard, let down some of our defensiveness, and represents all of the best of the bridge building that I think we're seeing much more of now. So his sort of the moment that I think signals this as much as anything was his willingness to go have an unscripted interview with Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes and to allow that to play. That alone was in symbolic ways sort of signaled it's a new day.
Yeah. And then the Washington Post is talking about how the interview with Mike Wallace, how Mike Wallace was joking with President Hinckley and complimenting him more than attacking him, which again was kind of a shift in the way that people were looking at the church.
Yeah, certainly. And I think it's significant that President Hinckley was leading the church in two of the biggest media moments the church has experienced, the 1997 sesquicentennial wagon train, which was, by all accounts, seems to have been somewhat serendipitous and unexpected. I think it sort of caught church public affairs officials a little by surprise on just how much interest there was, how much international interest there was. And they certainly ran with it and developed new technologies, CD-ROM technologies to provide more resources for journalists. And it came off so well that it was a nice trial run, as some public affairs officials saw it, for the 2002 Olympics, which blew everything out of the water in terms of previous attention to the church and to Utah. And President Hinckley seems to signal that we're going to navigate this in a really open way. We're going to cooperate with journalists. We're going to do all we can to help them see who we are as a people, and to be very open in doing so. And I think those were significant moments.
Well, I think it's so interesting when they say, and the winner is the church, because people saw members of the church who were donating time, donating translation services, and people saw the people of Utah as being very hospitable, very gracious. And so a lot of people coming from all over the world were able to, they had this view of what it might be like, and then found that it wasn't like that at all. And they had the microphones that allowed the world to hear this different point of view.
Yeah, well said. I think President Hinckley's decision and announcement that church members and missionaries would not proselytize during the Olympics went a long way to quieting some of those initial concerns and fears that people had. And I think that was a really appropriate move to allow people to be curious without feeling threatened. And it seemed to pay off.
The Post actually had an article that said, "What do Mormons wear? ? A polite smile." And that just says so much about how the way that the church interacted with Olympic officials and the way we welcomed the world to Utah was definitely seen and appreciated.
Yeah. I think the funniest line in that article, the reporter goes on to say that because church members and missionaries were not proselytizing, the only religious shenanigans were coming from those angry protesters outside of Temple Square who were protesting the church. And then he said, everyone looked nutty except the Mormons, who looked golden. So it's just such a great line. But so he said that this, kind of the low key approach, the low pressure approach was the right way to go. That was, Hank Stoiver from the Washington Post.
Tell me a little bit about Mitt Romney's run for president. The first time he ran, the second time he ran. At first, people didn't think it would gather that much attention because they thought he didn't have much of a chance, but he kind of proved everybody wrong as he moved forward. And how did that impact the image of the church?
Yeah, this is such an interesting thing as we think about this, and probably most of the listeners remember this really well. And so now, with a little bit of time in retrospect, such an interesting period. I think what was the biggest surprise for many Latter-day Saints when Mitt Romney declared his intentions to run for president the first time, so this is 2006, 2007, the 2008 campaign season, was that on the heels of the Olympics, on the heels of mounting national respect for Gordon B. Hinckley, I think a lot of Latter-day Saints were taken by surprise at how much negative press Mitt Romney generated because of his religious affiliation. And this I think a lot of Latter-day Saints may have felt like, I thought we had moved past this. I thought some of these things had been put to rest, and yet here they come roaring back. A lot of things were dredged up. And it felt like a rehashing of some of the old tropes, a lot of the things from the 1980s. And so I think it's hard to argue that religion was not a serious drag on Mitt Romney's campaign in 2008. But then, thankfully, from a historian's perspective and for these comparative purposes, I'm so grateful that Mitt Romney ran again, regardless of how you think about politics, just the chance for comparison, because 2011 and 2012, to me, felt markedly different from 2007, 2008. And I think a couple of good reasons for that. Number one is that the journalists had already rehashed a lot of these things.
So that was old news.
Old news, and journalists are always looking for something new. But I also think that there had been enough significant things happen in those intervening years that had generated a lot more conversation. And so that the conversations, the discussions around Mitt Romney's religion in 2012 felt much more substantive and less slanted, and that there were even a number of journalists who were promoting that view and were speaking out against those who were using the cult label. I think Mitt Romney, there were some bridges that were crossed that I don't know if we will ever have to go back over again. So we had some prominent evangelical Christian figures like Rich Mao, president of Fuller Seminary at the time, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, who speak out against some of their co-religionists who were using the cult label, and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association drops Mormons from their list of cults. So these were significant moments, maybe symbolic more than anything, but still that signaled something had changed, and that this dialogue was moving forward a new view of the church.
As we're listening in this episode of Professor J.B. Hawes' research, I'm often asked by others where they can go to find good research on various subjects dealing with the church. Well, as I say to kick off most of these commercial breaks, if you're interested in peer-reviewed, high-quality gospel scholarship about Latter-day Saint history, doctrine, and practice, go to BYU's Religious Studies Center. It is a great place to check out. One part of their website at rsc.byu.edu that I would call your attention to right now is the Gospel Topics link that you can find on their main page. Although the topics are similar to others that you would find in some other places, what makes this topic page unique is that each topic links you to peer-reviewed articles and chapters related to that subject that's been published by the Religious Studies Center. For example, say that you want to learn more about the law of consecration as you study the Doctrine and Covenants. You can just click on consecration on the topics page, and that quick, you've got 20 peer-reviewed research articles dealing with that subject. It's just a great resource that everybody should know about that can aid you in your personal study on various topics of the church from high-quality scholars. Again, it's the Gospel Topics page on the Religious Studies Center website. Check it out at rsc.byu.edu. We've been listening to Professor J.B. Haws talk about his recent publication On the Pages of the Post, Latter-day Saints and Washington's Newspaper of Record, published in the RSC's book volume on the history of the church in Washington, D.C. In part 2 of Why Religion, we like to get a little bit more into specific applications related to this publication for the everyday saint. How can it help us in living, learning, and loving the restored gospel? We pick up here with Professor Haws giving some great insights into the position of the church today, and also discussing some evidence about how the church seems to be growing up and moving into better places of security regarding our public perception.
Yeah, I think that significantly that Associated Press report that had that headline identified some ways that the church had made some real progress. One of those is that there was new attention to the diversity in Mormon identity and views. The I'm a Mormon campaign had done quite a bit to introduce a new feeling of diversity among Latter-day Saints. That
You can't paint the church with one brushstroke. Right. We're all conservative. We're all Republican. You can't do that.
Right. Yeah. And so that Matt Bowman, a great historian, he wrote that was one of the things that was one of the myths that was dispelled by the 2012 campaign, that Mormonism was a monolith. And I think that's really important. And I think that's something about the church that should be continually reinforced.
Well, I think that Utah surprised the world by passing a landmark LGBT rights bill that actually has become quite a model for others as far as tolerance and fairness. And I don't think people expected that.
I think one of the themes that seems to come out is the national media is noting that church members and the church are doing unexpected things, that they sometimes defy expectations, or that what the stereotype would say is not always what is happening. It's much more nuanced than that.
I think we see that in the response to the Book of Mormon musical. Everybody thought the church would be up in arms, and yet the Book of Mormon musical comes out, and the response from the church was simply to take out an ad in the program saying, "Hey, the book's better."
Yeah, that's right.
You've seen the play, now read the book.
Yeah.
And I think that response won hearts instead of Latter-day Saints saying, "Oh, we're so angry about this."
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that is something to keep in mind, that for those who are interested in public perception and how Americans view Latter-day Saints, is that it's a much more nuanced story, and we should give real attention to that nuance.
I think it's interesting here that you write, a preoccupation with public perception can lead to pandering. And if we're too worried about what the world thinks of us, then we're not worried about what we really need to be worried about, and that is building the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
And preparing for the second coming. So I don't think that we sit around thinking about, how will the world receive this? But it is interesting to look back over these decades and see the perceptions of the world as we've been about our Father's business. I think in 1978, there was an article that said, quotes a Latter-day Saint saying, "We don't usually go in on interfaith things." Well, a lot's changed since 1978. Yeah. And now a March 2019 headline is talking about the Pope meeting with President Nelson and talking together about the relief efforts that they have been engaged in as an interfaith effort in 43 countries. So I think a lot of things have changed.
Yeah. An analogy that others have used that I think really has some insight is, think of a young teenager going to his or her first stake dance or school dance, and how awkward you feel. That is, those early teenage years are such years of awkwardness. You worry about anyone noticing any blemish, any fault, and because it's just going to compound, and so you don't want to put yourself in any kind of vulnerable place. And then miraculously, wonderfully, as part of the plan of life, we seem to grow out of that, and we move past that sort of adolescent awkwardness.
And that preoccupation with
Right.
what others think of me.
And we start to become comfortable in our own skin, and we recognize that we're not perfect at everything, that we make mistakes, but we're okay with that. We're able to be a little more vulnerable. And
so do you think the church is growing up?
I do. I really do. I think that so much of that's happening with church history, the honesty and transparency of the Saints volumes, the Gospel Topics essays, the Joseph Smith papers, I think reflect some of that comfortable in our own skin. I think the way the church handled the Book of Mormon musical is another great example of this. And I think there is a sense that we're we're all right with admitting our failings and looking at our history and pointing out places where we've made mistakes and we wish we would have done better. We are learning lessons and we're moving on. Terrell Givens said in 2007, Helen Whitney produced a documentary for PBS called The Mormons, and she interviewed Terrell Givens. And in that documentary, Terrell Givens said, "We want to be mainstream enough that people give our message a fair hearing." Back to your point about...
Boy, doesn't that just say it all?
Yeah.
We want to be transparent enough that people will trust us as they listen to the gospel that's been restored, that we have the responsibility to proclaim to the world.
Right. Yeah, and I think that goes back to your point about pandering. I think that Latter-day Saints have cared a lot about their public image, mostly in order to make sure that our message gets across fairly and that we're able to express the things that we care most deeply about.
If you're interested in reading Professor Hawes' excellent article, we've provided a link to it on our podcast website, whyreligion.byu.edu. That's whyreligion, letter Y, whyreligion.byu.edu. There on our website, you can also find a link to Professor Hawes' bio if you want to learn more about him and his work, along with access to links of articles from previous podcast episodes. And since we're talking about public perception, if you're loving what you're hearing, we would be honored if you would share and recommend this podcast with your friends and family who might not know about it but might love it. Just give them a quick, "Hey, I've been listening to a great podcast. Have you heard of Why Religion?" We really appreciate you spreading the word. And last, be sure to subscribe to the podcast to get automatic downloads of the episodes. And leave us a rating on your podcast platform. It really helps in the promoting algorithms so that others can be recommended to and more easily find us. Your efforts have really helped and are a major part of why the Why Religion podcast is downloaded tens and thousands of times every month in at least 138 different countries. All right, we've arrived at the last part of Why Religion, where we like to talk a little bit about the professor's academic journey in faith. Here is J.B. Haws telling us about his background, including what J.B. stands for, why J.B. chose to be an academic, a religious educator, come to BYU, and why he is a person of faith.
And JB, the first thing I'm going to ask you is, what does JB stand for? I have always just known you as JB.
That's right. It's my one way to stay as a man of mystery. Good question. I'm happy to say it. JB stands for John Ben. I'm named after both of my grandpas, Grandpa John and Grandpa Ben.
But so that you wouldn't get mixed up, that they just started calling you JB.
That's right. Apparently my parents planned to call me JB from the get-go, so I've gone by my initials my whole life.
Tell me a little bit about your journey, how you came to BYU. What brought you here?
As long as I can remember, I have always loved BYU. I mean, just have been a BYU fanatic. That came from my parents and my grandpa.
Maybe it came with the name.
Maybe so. Loved BYU sports, loved everything that BYU stood for. So I've been just a lifelong BYU fan. I started teaching seminary full-time for the church in the Salt Lake area. And in the fall of 1999, I heard word that BYU was starting a new graduate program, Masters in Religious Education. And that really intrigued me. I had planned to start another master's program that very fall, but the prospect of...
You say another.
Yeah,
had you already gotten a master's?
No, I had planned to start a different master's program that fall and was enrolled in classes ready to start when I heard about this upcoming new program, and the idea of being able to study religion at BYU was really intriguing to me. So I deferred on that other program and said I wanted to give it a shot to see what happened with the Master's of Religious Education program. And sure enough, it started, and I started in the fall. I started in the summer of 2000 with a group of 15 fantastic in our cohort. Fantastic.
Were
people.
you the first cohort?
We were the first cohort, and we had remarkable professors. It was such a mind-expanding, soul-expanding educational experience. Never had anything like it. And it was everything you could have hoped for in a wonderful graduate program and with phenomenal people. And so I think I had sort of in my mind had an idea that I wanted to go on for a PhD after a master's degree, but that program really solidified that desire. And so after finishing the master's degree, I started a doctoral program in American history at the University of Utah, and loved my time there. It also couldn't have been better. It was fantastic professors, great program. Really
so initially, when you started teaching seminary, you weren't thinking about advanced degrees.
Well, I think I had at that time had planned on doing advanced degrees. One of the things that the church does well in the Seminary Institute program is encouraging its teachers to pursue advanced education. They offer a lot of help, a lot of support. So I think that had been in my mind. What probably changed at BYU was the direction of that study, the chance to study in the religious education master's program. I think that probably changed the direction I went, and eventually ended up focusing on, really interested in Latter-day Saint history, 20th century Latter-day Saint history, kind of the American religious landscape. And so those graduate programs were really formative. And all the while teaching seminary, I loved teaching seminary. It was an incredible job. I mean, what's not to love about being with high schoolers and talking about meaningful things, and had so many great experiences teaching seminary in the Salt Lake and then the Ogden areas. So I taught seminary for 14 years. And when I finished my PhD, I had continued to love that aspect of research and writing, and so the position at BYU seemed like a dream combination. So when one came open and applied and it worked out, I just felt like I had landed in something magical, and it really has been that.
Well, I know you've made an incredible difference here, and you have influenced a lot of students and a lot of faculty. So thank you for the good you do. How do you do it personally? I mean, how do you balance being a researcher, an academic, and being a member of the church? How do you, in a day and age where so many people turn away from God in the name of higher education, in the name of academics, how do you turn toward God when you're in that same world?
Well, a lot of elements in this, but I think one of the things that happens to most of us, maybe all of us, as we study a topic, whatever the topic, study often, and I think in our best moments, evokes in us a deep humility. We realize how little we know, and the more we study, I think it becomes more apparent to us that we still know very little, and there is just so much going on, so much to learn, so much to know, and that humility that sort of reminds us of our own limitations and our own insignificance and our own deficiencies, I think can keep us grounded, and that humility can pull us up short when we want to be rash or make snap judgments, and can cause us to pause and to say, I should think more about this. And I think those spaces that are created by those pauses and those limitations and those deficiencies are spaces where light can break through, and we can feel a connection to real truth and to the things that matter the very most. And we start to realize and be reminded over and over that there are sources of truth and wisdom and guidance that are that are more powerful and more real and bring clarity. And in no way do I think that minimizes the study. In fact, I think that makes it more important, because I think then we become motivated to do all we can to understand and to make the world better. But we realize that the best way to come at that is when it's aided, enabled by grace, by something bigger than us, and we've realized that how dependent and reliant we are on our Savior Jesus Christ, and on Heavenly Father, on the Spirit that brings sudden strokes of ideas and pure intelligence, and magnifies us in ways that we could never do on our own. And there's only one source we can give credit to for that, and we're reminded of that again and again.
Thank you for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of religious education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is Anthony Sweat. I'm the executive producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes, from BYU Religious Education, Professors Brad Wilcox, Casey Griffiths, and Ryan Sharp. Recording and mixing were done by BYU students Mitchell Bashford and Connor Miller. Say hi, Mitchell and Connor.
Hey, guys.
Hi.
Original music and scoring for Why Religion podcast was created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
and Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion on wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a rating. It really helps. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by Brigham Young University religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith.